Ruth chapter 2. Hear the word of the Lord. Now, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to the young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." And at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean, even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening, and then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over from being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I have worked today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. May the Lord add his blessings to the reading of his holy word. Well, ever had a coincidence? Maybe something too coincidental just to be chance? How about a coincidental rendezvous? One of my favorite professors in seminary, whom I met outside of class, one of only two I met outside of class, was William Lane. I have a commentary on Mark from him I bought at the time. He was a fairly well-known scholar. He was a visiting professor at the seminary and a full-time professor at a university in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and an interim pastor there in Bowling Green that I later pastored at briefly, over a decade later. He had died in the meantime. About 20 years after that, at Joshua's 2019 graduation from NC State, held in this large basketball arena, we go in, and apparently at random, we sit down, and while we're waiting for it to begin, I hear a man behind me mention Bowling Green, Kentucky, and I turn around and say that I lived there for a little while, and we talk, and the man introduces himself as something, I forgot his first name, but Lane, last name Lane. And I said, hey, there used to be a famous professor there named William Lane. And the man said, he was my father. It just so happens that we were right in front of the son of one of my favorite professors from 30 years before, one of the, only two professors at my entire time in seminary that I met outside of class, who was also the interim pastor at the same church I was later at. I'm not sure exactly what that means, except maybe I was in the right place, I guess. But it's just too coincidental to be a coincidence. Another one. The vote at another church that led to this church was a choice between two things. The choice was determined by the others, not by me, between stay and go. That is, the people of the church were asked to vote for stay or to go. Go won, which led to the question whether me and my family, whether us, we should go elsewhere. We should just move away. And as we were reorganizing and very busy and looking for a place to live and moving and everything, having been told by people to go, I decided to redo a series of sermons I had done earlier on 1 Timothy, which is also convenient because 1 Timothy is about organizing the church, and we were looking into whether we should start a new church, which turned out to be this one. I opened the computer file with my sermon notes on it just a day or two after the stay or go vote, having totally forgotten what originally, several years before, I had entitled the first sermon from 1 Timothy chapter 1. To my surprise, to my shock, I'll never forget when the file opened and I saw that it just so happened, coincidentally, to be entitled Stay. As Yogi Berra said, that's too coincidental to be a coincidence. Albert Einstein said coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. And maybe that's true sometimes, but some coincidences are just so coincidental, like those that led to this church. They're not really anonymous at all. They're God's way of saying that, I'm in control here, even over things that appear out of control. Coincidences are God's providence that are right on the border of being miraculous. There's nothing about just happening to sit in front of the son of your favorite professor from 30 years before in California and the interim pastor of your church about 20 years before in Kentucky, coincidentally sitting right next to him, or the title of the sermon happening to be just so happening coincidentally to be the same word in the church vote just a few days before that conveys the message you desperately need. There's nothing about all that kind of defies the laws of nature, that's a miracle that would just convince a skeptic that's technically supernatural. But still, it's just too coincidental to be a coincidence. Now, Naomi would have understood all this immediately. Well, of course, he is God Almighty, the one she mentioned last week, the El Shaddai. Modern people have a hard time understanding this. First, they like to think that they are the captains of their fate. They make their free choices, uninfluenced, undetermined by anything else. They're in control, they think, of their entire lives. So they don't like to think God's actually in control of it all. And you think of that a basketball arena. What went into my sitting here or there and his sitting there? We ended up right by each other. Both of us made what we thought were free decisions, and yet they were determined by God. So, did I make a free decision? Yes. Was God behind it? Yes. And we like to put those like they're contradictory. They're not. And we'll see that here in Ruth chapter 2. But modern people like to say, you either got to have one or the other. Either God's in control or we're free. Well, God says no. Both. Both and. You ever seen this meme online? This Chinese girl? It's like, why not both? That's what I think. That's what God says. Is my will free or is God in control? And God says, why not both? Well, skeptics will even say that if God's in control and bad things happen like disasters and diseases and deaths, and even Naomi thinks this for a little while, then God is a moral monster. He's against us. Christians won't admit that. We should know better to say that, especially in church. Instead, they'll either ignore the issue completely. Let's pretend God's not in control of the disaster. They're out of control. Or claim that God has given us over to our own free will, and so he's left things out of control. So they make a free will defense. Again, getting back to this, it's either got to be God in control or our free will. Either one. And God says, no, they're both. And so what such people really mean is that we don't really trust him with the controls. It's like a teenager with a car. You might think he means well, but you're afraid if you've let him drive without supervision, he'll wreck the thing. But here in Ruth chapter 2, we see again that God is Almighty, Shaddai, that he is in control, and we should be glad he is, because he knows what he's doing. He is controlling the lives of people because of his steadfast love. The great Hebrew word, even the Psalm today, Psalm 143, reveal to me, show to me your chesed, your steadfast love, his loyal love, his covenant commitment to do good to his people. So the entire book of Ruth is a story to show, among other things, what this steadfast love, what this chesed, what it is, what it means. Here in chapter 2, we see that steadfast love is at least three things. First, it is consistent. Then it is considerate. And finally, it is covering. First, set the scene. Naomi has returned from Moab to Bethlehem, telling the other ladies there that the Lord has brought her back empty. I went away full. The Lord has brought me back empty, she said. The Almighty, calls him the Almighty, the Shaddai, has brought calamity on me, she says. And Ruth hands her a tissue at that moment. You know she's got to do that. Hands her a tissue. Ruth's right there. And they all feel sorry for Naomi. Ruth feels sorry for Naomi. She definitely believes in the sovereignty, the control of God over all things. What she doubts is whether God is good to her. But it just so happens, what she still can't see, she has arrived empty, she says, but not really. She has this loyal daughter-in-law. And the barley harvest has begun. And that's not a coincidence at all. Chapter 1 verse 6 says that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. It's not just left up to the laws of nature of the Lord, does it? That's why they have harvest coming. The Lord has made the fields flourish, and Naomi is crying that she's empty, but she has Ruth to go out to those fields for her and glean for her. And she has another relative, Boaz. Notice the chapter begins with that. Boaz, a relative of Elimelech. You could be thinking, wait, Naomi said she was empty, but she has this relative. Yeah, she forgot. She's not empty at all. It's described in verse 1 as worthy. The word could be distinguished, or he's honored. He's a noble man. He's noble as in good. He owns a field around Bethlehem. So he's a property owner. He's fairly well off. Naomi had either forgotten about Boaz, or she's just so devastated by her own personal losses that she can't think of anything else. But now we know that she's not empty. We know, even as Naomi is crying about being empty, that Boaz is nearby. But God remembered, and he's about to arrange a rendezvous. As the harvest begins, Ruth has to go out and glean after any harvesters that will let her. Notice the way it's put, after them, means literally behind them. Now, Israel had a law in Leviticus chapter 19 and chapter 23 that they were not supposed to totally harvest their fields. Don't strip them bare, but leave the edge, the margins, unharvested so that the poor can come and help themselves. And anything the field hands drop, when they're picking up the harvested crop, don't just go back and pick it up. So you're taking everything, but leave it, like for any needy person like Ruth, to go out and get it. This is sort of Israel's welfare program. This is their way of taking care of the poor who didn't have any fields, anything of their own. Notice that they would have to actually go out and work for it. So they have to do some work, not just given to them, but something is left out there for them to get. And of course, some people aren't going to follow the law. And others might do it technically. They kind of, I really got to do this. I want to harvest all the crop, but they'll do it reluctantly because they're made to. Leave a few barley stalks up at the edge and maybe treat any destitute people who come by to try to pick it up as rudely. Get out of here. And some will do the minimum and resent having to do it. And some, if they see some scrounger taking too much, will send out their field hands as ruffians to assault them. And Naomi mentions that in verse 22 near the end. Notice that? You go somewhere else, you may get mistreated. But this Boaz, he'll take care of you. He won't let that happen. Ruth says she wants to go out and harvest wherever she can, quote, find favor in verse 2. So she doesn't know where that is. Just going out hoping that she will find favor. So Ruth goes out at random, as far as she can tell. She's making a free choice. Free will is at work. She sees some reapers in the field and goes behind them, picking up everything they missed. In the middle of verse 3, this is key. In the middle of verse 3, notice, she happened on a particular field. We could translate this, she just so happened. Can you believe it? With a knowing smile. What a coincidence. course, it's too coincidental to be a coincidence. She happened to go to Boaz's field, who's a relative of Naomi that Naomi has forgotten about. She doesn't know it. She doesn't know who Boaz is. Notice Naomi didn't tell her about Boaz. This is why you get the words there of their conversation. Please let me go out and harvest wherever I can find favor. And Naomi says, yeah, go. She doesn't say, yeah. Oh, by the way, try Boaz's field. It's right there on the corner of, First and Main or whatever. No, nothing like that. Naomi doesn't remember Boaz at all. So Ruth said she'll go out and look to glean wherever she can get treated kindly. So many fields out there around Bethlehem. The word Bethlehem means house of bread. So there's fields everywhere. And so they bring in a lot of grain. Everybody is harvesting. Now, what are the chances she just so happens to find herself in Boaz's field? The author reminds us at the end of verse 3 that Boaz is a relative of Elimelech. Notice he repeats that twice. Verse 1, relative of Elimelech. Verse 3, it's not because we forget 2 verses later. No, it's because we need to be reminded she just so happened to come on the relative of Naomi, a relative, mind you. You know what that means? A relative. It means he could be a redeemer. It just so happens upon his field, of all the fields there are. And then God's control over everything. That's his control over everything, even over where Ruth freely chooses to go gleaning. She makes a free choice. She looks out, uses her free will. I'm going to go there, I guess. And it happens to be Boaz's field. And we see here that for his people, for Naomi and Ruth, that control, somehow God guided her free choice. And that's loving. That's good. Well, first, it's consistent. It's steadfast, as in the English translation here. Ruth herself is steadfast, having committed herself in the famous words of Ruth chapter 1, where you lodge, Naomi, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. And so she goes with her all the way back to Bethlehem, house of bread, and is now working by gleaning the leftovers in other people's fields. Now think of what do you call it, low, desperate life this is. You don't have a field of your own. You just have to go out to a field and hope you can pick up scraps left over from the harvesters and that you won't get assaulted by the owners of the field there. That's life. And as far as she knows, as Ruth knows, this could be the rest of her life. This could be what she's doing from here on out. And one of the desperately poor picking up the scraps from the paid workers, at least the real harvesters, they're paid, they got jobs and they got their own house, but you're below them. You're just picking up what you can, going through the dumpsters. So this is it. This is what she committed herself to do consistently. It just so happens she's in the field of a relative of her deceased father-in-law. Boaz shows up, blesses the reapers. The Lord be with you. Showing, as Piper says, he's a God-saturated man. His foreman is there supervising, and all the workers say, the Lord be with you. And he asks his foreman, whose young woman is this? Pointing at Ruth. She's moving gradually through the field, picking up whatever she can. The foreman says, well, she's the young Moabite woman. No, it's the. She's the one everyone's been talking about. Remember, the whole town of Bethlehem was abuzz about Naomi returning with her loyal daughter-in-law. Ruth was the talk of the town along with Naomi, and everyone, the foreman, everyone's talking about them. And foreman said she asked politely to glean after the reapers. That's, in other words, after they're done. And she's been consistently working from early morning with only a short break. Now, love today is usually celebrated in movies and songs and poems for his passion, a brilliant burst of feelings. But in the Bible, it is celebrated mainly for its faithfulness, its endurance, its loyalty, being a steady, consistent commitment. Love is a long-distance race, not a sprint. Here, Ruth has committed herself. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. I'll still be there after you die. She's consistently living that out. She's out in the field from dawn until dusk. She's working hard, get some food for herself and for Naomi because of her love. As we sang about last week from Lamentations, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. God's steadfast love is consistent. It's enduring. It's for the long haul. It never ceases. It's up early, working every morning. And if you have it, that love in you will be consistent and enduring. Steadfast love is also considerate. It puts itself in the place of the loved, sees what life is like for them, considers them, what they're going through. Boaz says to Ruth, you've gotten enough from us now, by the way. We left a little out for you. You've gotten it. Now go try somebody else, you moocher. No, he's considerate. He says, now listen, my daughter. Notice he calls her daughter tender. Notice the tenderness of his words. Do not go glean in another field. Don't bother about another field. Or don't leave this one. But keep close to my young women. In other words, stay. Stay here with the women harvesters I have working for me. Now they say that during the harvest, there in those times, the men would take the sickle and like a swing blade and cut down the grain, be the harder work. And then the women would come after them. So you're kind of gathering together all that's been cut down, stacking it, and then binding it together. Boaz is saying here, you stay close to the women, so you look like you're one of them. Even the other women are actually my harvesters. They're working for me. You're really not, but you can stay close to them, so you look like you're part of them. And so Boaz is saying, you Ruth, stay close. You be a part of us. You be included. You won't look like a straggler or a moocher. You're welcome here. Boaz considers her. What's it like to be, you have all these people working in the field and you're straggling behind, and you're obviously the odd one out. You're obviously the destitute. You're the beggar. You're the low one here. And so Boaz considers that, what it's like for her to be in her position. He's not just thinking about his bottom line. Remember, he's a businessman, and this is his business. He makes his living by getting a good harvest. He owns this field, and he's hoping this time of year he planted it, weeded it, whatever else he had to do to it. The harvest now has come, and this is where the profit comes from. He's finally getting his income. And so you could think, well, I got to keep as much as I can. Inconsiderate men would look at people like Ruth, poor gleaners picking up their crops. You look at them as these are parasites, like Ebenezer Scrooges. Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? My taxes go to pay for welfare. I've got to look after myself here. Look out for number one, they say. But Boaz knew better. Boaz, the worthy man, here shows why he's worthy. He considers the needs of others, particularly the needs of the needy. He considers the humanity of those like Ruth who are barely getting by. And so he says in verse 9, he has charged the young men not to bother her. They're not going to harass you. And when she's thirsty, she can go to get a drink from the water that they provide for their own workers. In other words, you get our benefits too. So Boaz wasn't just keeping the letter of the law. He wasn't just, doing the very minimum he had to do to keep God's law. He was going beyond it to the spirit of the law. He wasn't just doing the minimum by leaving some crops at the margins, but was considerate of the marginalized, not thinking just of his profit margin. So Ruth, unlike some poor people today, who think they have a right to what's given to them and aren't appreciative, Ruth is amazed at the favor that's given her. The favor in verse 10. She bows to the ground. Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? She doesn't feel entitled to this. But the law lets me have it. I can take as much as I want. No. She knows this is favor that's given to her. She doesn't deserve it. She realizes that they could say, Israelites first. Sure, that's our law, but that's for Israelites. You Moabites, go back to your own country and scrounge there. But notice how Boaz responds in verses 11 and 12. All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. The story of Ruth, the epitome of a steadfast love, it's gotten around and he's heard it completely. Boaz has heard about it, and so he's moved by that. He realizes, she said, your people will be my people. Your God, my God. And now this Moabitess she's one of us. So she's going to be treated like one of us. Boaz says, you left your father and mother and your native land and came to people that you did not know before. Remember, he's responding to her question of why have I found favor since I'm a foreigner? I know you could exclude me. And his answer, steadfast love has brought you here. away from your people to a new people. You said, you committed. I heard it. Your people will be my people. I'm going to be a part of you. The Lord will be my God. And that's what steadfast love does. It takes people away from their native people, the people of this world, where money or pleasure or ego or ethnicity or race or nationality is their God. And it brings them to a new people, to other people to whom God has shown his steadfast love. So Boaz is considering what it's like for Ruth. Have you considered what it's like for people who have left their native land, who are far away from their people? We have several people like that around here. You don't have very many people here, but several of them are like that here, who are far away from their people. What's it like when your biggest holiday isn't recognized at all? Where you are, where you're from, the biggest holiday is not recognized in the place where you are now. So like for when your biggest holiday, Chinese New Year, isn't observed by no one around you anymore. You can't even get the day off. I lived in Singapore through Thanksgiving. It's Thursday there. You have to go to work. And the best I could do is go to a Denny's after work and order a turkey sandwich. That was Thanksgiving. Makes a difference when people consider you. Because of your steadfast love, Boaz considers Ruth, her needs for food, her refreshment, for peace. And he doesn't consider her to be a foreigner because of her steadfast love. Steadfast love is considerate and also covering. Boaz has already promised covering, protection for Ruth as long as she works in his fields. He is not going to let the young men, his field hands, bother her. Boaz tells Ruth in verse 12, the Lord repay you for what you have done. For your steadfast love, Ruth, may the Lord repay you. A full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings, this is important here, it'll become even more important in the next chapter, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Ruth, the Moabite, notice she's called that. She's still a Moabite, okay, that's where she's from, is now part of the true Israel. Because she's come under the Lord's covering, under his wings. Your God will be my God. I'm coming under his wings. Like a baby bird just hatched, getting refuge from the mother bird. Ruth is now getting her refuge, her covering from the Lord. And refuge gives rest. Ruth is resting under the Lord's wings. And Boaz is honoring that. The Lord repay you, he says. And he does his part to see that she is repaid. And Ruth is just amazed by Boaz's steadfast love, that he's providing her with the opportunity, the protection, the welcome, the respect. He's covering her, insulating her from harassment. Young men aren't going to bother you here. Don't go anywhere else, whether you might get bothered, you might get harassed. Here you have covering. Remember in chapter 1, Naomi pleaded with both Orpah and Ruth to go back home to your parents, and there you can get rest. There you can get security. There you can get the covering of another husband in Moab. And Orpah did, but Ruth clung to Naomi. And by doing that, Ruth was saying, I'll get my covering from the Lord, with no hope for a husband, anything like that. But she would seek her covering from Naomi's God. And so here, at least in part, Boaz provides it. She says in verse 13, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, small l in English, a term of respect. For you have comforted me and spoken kindly to me, to your servant. She's comforted. Literally in Hebrew, that means you've spoken to my heart. Not just words to give me information. Your words went down in my heart. Now, of course, the words are comforting because they were backed up by action. Boaz didn't just say, the Lord bless you. Now you've taken enough from us. Get out of here. Go to another field. No, he said, the Lord bless you, and then practically provided what Ruth needed to be blessed. You have spoken, and she responds, you have spoken kindly to my heart, to your servant, though I'm not one of your servants. I'm not one of your field hands, not one of your employees that you're looking after so that they can work. In other words, you provide the water and the food so that they can work all day. I'm not one of those, but you're treating me like I am, which is good. Kind words are backed up by consistent, considerate action. Speak to her heart. And this is the pinnacle of the chapter, where Boaz blesses Ruth, says, may the Lord give you a full reward for coming to him under his wings for a covering. That's what steadfast love does. It draws people effectively to the Lord. The invitation goes out to all people. As the Lord Jesus said, come to me, all who labor like Ruth in the fields and are heavy laden with grief, with tragedies, with questions about where food or shelter, with security, whether love is going to come, where it's all coming from. And Jesus says, come to me. And he says, and I will give you rest, covering. Jesus says, come to me all who labor in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Matthew chapter 11, verse 27. The previous verse says, no one knows the Son except the Father, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. To reveal himself, I assume, to reveal the Son. So no one comes at Jesus' invitation, even though it is to all who labor. Understand? But the only ones who come are those whom Jesus chooses to reveal himself. In other words, all are invited. Come to me. But only the chosen, the revealed to, come. And Ruth was one of those. So she gets rest, she gets consideration, a covering, a place among God's covenant people. Not first because she had steadfast love, although as if she earned her way in by being loyal to Naomi. That was sort of the work she did that granted her the reward from God of being one of his people. No. It was because God first, God, the one who arranged that she would just so happen to be in Boaz's field. It wasn't a coincidence. God had steadfast love on her. The book of Ruth is first the story of God's steadfast love. So this is the pinnacle of the chapter. You ever been mountain climbing? You reach the pinnacle. What do you do then? Well, then you got to go back down. And you see the kind of the same sights all over again. But then you see it from a different angle. This is the pinnacle of the chapter. Boaz blesses Ruth in verse 12 for taking refuge under the wings of the Lord. And the rest of the chapter takes us back down. Like mountain climbing, once you've reached the summit, you go back down, back through other facets of steadfast love. Same ones we've seen before. We see them again. The summit is the Lord's covering. He provides for his people rest for your souls, for those he loved, like Ruth. Then back down again, we see steadfast love is, again, considerate. In verse 14, they have their lunch break. Boaz invites Ruth. Remember, she's not part of the work gang officially. She's just a straggler, or she's just a beggar, really, picking up the scraps. But Boaz invites her, hey, Ruth, come over here. Come on, join us. Join our lunch over here. All the hands, the employees are taking our break for lunch. You come join us. Come. Where have we heard that before? Come. Come, you who labor. Ruth, have your rest. Have lunch with us. He doesn't have to provide lunch for the poor gleaners. He should provide lunch for his workers, understand. But Ruth's not one of those. She's just one of the beggars. So he doesn't have to provide lunch for her, but he does. They have bread and they have wine and roasted grain. Boaz passes the roasted grain right to her. Notice that detail? It says he passed it right to her. Otherwise, he didn't just leave it there and she could help herself. No, he made sure that she understood, you're included here. We're considering you. We're thinking about you. She went up to her. Here's the food. She has enough to be full. She can even take a doggy bag back home to Naomi. She can take a box back to her. Then when she goes back to work, Boaz goes far beyond the call of duty. And he tells his field hands, verse 15, let her glean even among the sheaves. Remember, what she's supposed to do is with these stragglers, is anything that's left unharvested or anything that's fallen down, that she can take. But Boaz is saying, even that harvested stuff, the stuff we piled up over there, the sheaves, we've already worked to take up. She can even go there and take whatever she wants. Stacked grain. She can take from there. In verse 16, he tells them to pull out. She even goes further than that. Not only can she go among the sheaves. Hey, I tell you what, guys. Go pick some out of the harvested of the stacks. Lay it out for her. Already bundled, and they're looking at it. We harvested that stuff. I know. Go lay it out for her. And do not rebuke her. He says it twice. Don't rebuke her. Don't challenge her. Don't tell her to go somewhere else. No. Let her take whatever she wants. He's considerate, isn't he? Now, sometimes there are Christians who say they're compassionate, that they care. They'll pray for you. I'll be your helper. I'll do whatever you want. Like James says, they'll say, be warm, be filled, to some poor, hungry, cold person, but then they won't actually share anything to alleviate their need for warmth, to fill their stomachs. They're not really considerate. It's a lack of love. And Boaz is the opposite of that. He blesses Ruth. The Lord bless you. He is the picture of blessing. He puts that into practice. Because of his open-handed generosity, Ruth is able to glean about 30 pounds of barley that day. That's what that ephah is. If you don't know what an ephah is. About 30 pounds. It seems to me like a lot of barley. In verse 17, it says 30 pounds. It's enough for several weeks or maybe even months of meals. Now, steadfast love is considerate practically. It's also consistent. Ruth gleans all that day, does the work of beating out what she's taken, separating the grain from the chaff, takes it back home to Naomi, and she's amazed. A 30-pound bag of beaten out barley. Not to mention the left, and she plops that down, and here's some leftovers from lunch you can have for your dinner. Ruth could stop there and be satisfied with enough food for the time being, but it says in the last verse that she went out like that every day, consistently throughout the entire barley, and then after the barley harvest comes the wheat harvest, living with, now providing for her mother-in-law. In that last verse of chapter 2, she lived with her. It's what she said she would do. She's consistently keeping her commitment. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Naomi is amazed at what Ruth brings home that first day. In verse 19, you can hear the astonishment in her voice. Where did you glean today? Where have you worked? Blessed is the man who took notice of you. Who could be so generous as to allow you to take that much of their grain? It's their grain. They allowed you to take that much away? Remember, Naomi didn't send Ruth out to Boaz's field and say, hey, Boaz, this guy's an easy touch. He's easy to take advantage of him. No, she had forgotten all about him. She has no idea where all this barley came from. She's probably thinking, did Ruth get lucky? Did she just happen upon a generous landowner? It's a coincidence. And so Ruth tells her, no, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. Boaz. That's a name she recognizes. Now I remember Boaz. Oh yeah. And now it begins to dawn on Naomi, who was earlier crying that the Lord had brought her back empty. You remember when Ruth handed her the tissue? Right at the beginning of barley harvest? It's like some of us, maybe you, when some disaster strikes, death or divorce, disease, disappointment. I'm devastated. Why has the Lord let this happen? I'm empty. He's against me. And you lose sight of his steadfast love until it just so happens. What? Ruth, on the first day of barley harvest, stumbles upon Boaz's field. Just a coincidence, right? The word comes back, stay. Maybe a new friend, a new opportunity, a new future, something better. Maybe just the grace that for now is sufficient. It dawns on Naomi in verse 20, may he be blessed by the Lord. The Lord. The Lord. The one she had cried earlier was against her, who had brought her back empty. When Ruth handed her the tissue, remember? When she wanted to be called bitter instead of pleasant at the beginning of barley harvest. Now it's the end of the first day. And there's something too coincidental to just be a coincidence. And it's dawning on Naomi May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness, there's that word again in Hebrew, by the way, whose chesed, whose steadfast love, translated as kindness here. The Lord's steadfast love, she finally realized, has not forsaken the living, me. I thought I was brought back empty. I thought he was against me, but he has not forsaken the living, me, or the dead, her husband and sons. Ruth didn't just get lucky. It wasn't just a coincidence. The Lord has kept his steadfast love with me, she realizes. And so Ruth can go back, secure, under a covering until the harvest is finished. The Lord's steadfast love has been keeping loyally covenant with her. The Lord is keeping his commitment to his people, no matter what just so happens. That's why Paul could say in Romans 8 that nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. Not distress or persecution or famine or danger or sword or death or rulers or demons. Nothing present, nothing to come. No power, no matter how high or low. Nothing in all of creation can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Naomi realizes when Ruth plops down this 30-pound bag of barley and tells her that it just so happened to come from Boaz, that it wasn't chance, that the Lord's steadfast love had not forsaken her. Do you realize that? The invitation still goes out to all who labor, all who carry heavy burdens, your burdens of your sins and your guilt, your grief, maybe your betrayals of others to you. Maybe your questions about whether the Lord is against you. You're trying to make a living while also trying to live. The invitation still goes out. Come to me, and I will give you rest